Good morning. I'm not sure Mercy Me and Darth Vader really go that well together. But that's okay. To talk to the knucklehead that picked both of those things. Happy Root Beer Float Day. I have no idea who decides these things, but, you might as well go with it. It tickled me to no end when Marcia Horner announced that today was Church Light. So I'm not sure if that means I'm just like a small Kyle. I mean, obviously, but, instead of pink Crocs, I'm wearing my new sandals, so, and I'm obviously, lighter than Kyle, since he was in 10th grade. So, welcome to Church Light and welcome to Kyle Light. Also want to send greetings from the family in Idaho. For those of you that haven't gotten an update from me, we got the wife and kids set up in a little apartment, and once I get out there, we'll renew our search for a home. They think they found a church out there that uses the Orange curriculum, just like here. And so they're very excited about that. And so be praying as they continue to get settled into that and make friends and connections in that new church. And pray also. We're having issues with our van. So potential that might have to be replaced sooner than we were hoping to do so. So please be in prayer for that. Well, let's launch into it this morning. Today, the first time I spoke here was about 18 months ago. It was a January or a February before Kyle was here. And they just needed someone to fill in the absence of a pastor, and out of desperation, I got tapped. And at that time, I talked about, I gave a sermon entitled Faith When Things Aren't Working Out. And as I was talking to Kyle a couple of weeks ago about what to talk about while he's at Hills Haven suffering for Jesus, we talked about circling back around and picking up on this notion of faith again, and talking about, what is it? What is it? How does it work? And can we address and dispel some very common misunderstandings that we have about faith? And so that's what we're going to do today. So we want to start out by considering some different notions of what faith is in our culture. For example, a sad devotion to an ancient religion. See, someone was paying attention with that. And you see this, right? The so-called new atheists today, Richard Dawkins and his ilk, who've decided that not believing in God isn't enough. They have to convince you to not believe in God as well. And they've done all these things like compared God to a mythical flying spaghetti monster. And so now in various locations across the earth, you have the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. And they make all these ludicrous statements like, you don't really need God to have morals and ethics, all the while holding to an essentially Judeo-Christian moral ethic. During the disaster in Haiti, 8 or 10 years ago, the church and Christians and faith-based organizations were rallying. They were raising money by the millions to support the work down there. And so Dawkins and his knuckleheads got together and said, well, we can get a bunch of atheists to give money to that. And so they started this big website for all these people with no faith to give money to help these poor, destitute Haitians. They shut it down after several months. They only raised a few $1,000. Sad devotion to an ancient religion. Blind acceptance, right? Faith is this blind thing, this blind leap that you take. Belief in the absence of proof or in spite of proof to the contrary. There was a philosopher of the Enlightenment period by the name of Immanuel Kant. And what Kant said is that there are those things that we know, that we can trust, those things that we can touch and taste and smell and hear and see. Those are the things that are real. But there's all these other things that define human existence. Love, friendship, charity, religious belief. And so he relegated these things to this upper story of belief. Kind of like all those things that are stored in Aunt Fanny's attic. You know, there are things that you aren't really comfortable getting rid of, but you don't want anybody to see. And so that's where Kant put these things. And for years, philosophers have done that. They've said, you know, you guys can have all these religious ideas, but don't tell me what to believe. Except for, you know, Dawkins, of course. He can tell you what to believe because he doesn't have this supernatural belief. So his belief is better than yours. But there's not any sort of empirical way of showing that your belief is better than mine. It just is because we're the ones that get to say that. So what about varying notions of faith within the church? Blind acceptance, right? How many times have you heard people say, faith is just trusting? It's just trusting God. You don't have to have a reason. You just trust God. Well, why? Because he said to. Ask a teenager if that explanation ever works. Again, there's a bunch of Christian theologians that thought that Kant feller was a pretty smart guy. Well, gosh, what are we going to do with that? So we'll do that. We'll take faith and we'll shove it up in Aunt Fanny's attic. And so you had Karl Barth, a Christian theologian from the middle of the 20th century, who made the claim. The resurrection of Christ was not an event of history. And yet, it remains a truth of great religious significance. So we can't put it down here because miracles don't happen, right? So it can't be an event of history. But up in Aunt Fanny's attic, it can still have meaning. Just don't try and, it's meaningful for me, but I can't say that it's meaningful for Chris. That's up to Chris to decide. And there are people within the church that completely buy into this. If you have proof, then you can't have faith. How many times have you heard a conversation that if you sat there and explained what just happened, God had no part in it? Well, how did God have no part in it? Well, because you just told me what happened. So how can God have a part in that? Forgetting classic Christian theology suggests that God works in two ways, not just one way. The one way that everyone agrees on is what's called primary agency. God just does things. Creation. He created the world out of nothing. The forming of Adam out of the dust. The forming of Eve out of Adam. He just did. The parting of the Red Sea. He just did. All these different things. By definition, these are miraculous occurrences that fall outside our realm of normal experience. The problem is for some people, that's the only thing God does. Classical Christian theology tells us that God also works through what's called secondary agency. The earth is spinning on its axis. The sun is rising and setting. Flowers bloom. Bees pollinate them. Fish swim. According to the Psalms, according to Colossians, God is at the heart of all of that. Colossians says that Jesus is upholding creation with his hands. Everything that happens in creation happens because of the work of God. So there's plenty of things that we can explain. And it's God. Sure, we've just told you physically this is how it happened, but you unplug it from the power source and it ceases to happen. I encounter this sometimes in medicine. I had someone in the hospital not long ago that they needed a procedure. They needed a potentially life-saving procedure. And I sat and talked to them, and I said, I'm just going to go home and pray and ask God to heal me. Okay. Why is that? Well, if I let you do this, then I'm not trusting God. What do you mean? If God wants to heal me, he can heal me. Well, what if God's method for healing you was bringing you to me? He had just told me a story about how God had used him to provide clothes for someone that didn't have clothes, and that was God. But him coming to me and receiving medicine to be healed was not God. Do you see where this gets all twisted and wrapped around the axle? This is nonsense. If we explain how something works, you've taken God out of the picture. In philosophy and theology, this is called the God of the gaps. Once science explains something, God has been pushed out of the room. Sometimes he's even pushed out of Aunt Fanny's attic. And yet, Christianity teaches us that God is undergirding everything. Faith comes in quantities. More faith is better. Well, how much faith is, so we talk about the parable of the mustard seed. Jesus said faith is like a mustard seed. He didn't say it was as big as a mustard seed. He didn't say it looked like he said it was like a mustard seed, meaning a mustard seed doesn't have to be very big to do a big thing. Faith isn't a quantity. There's not more faith and less faith. Faith is a muscle that you work and you exercise, and the more you exercise it, the better it works. I went on my first 20-mile bike ride for the first time in a year and a half or so yesterday. Ask me tomorrow how I'm doing. But then one of my favorite ones is this last one up here. I grew up in this tradition. God said it, I believe it, and that settles it. Anyone else heard that? Does it matter if we believe it or not? If God said it, Fred doesn't decide it's true because he believed it. Another Star Wars quote, Qui-Gon Jinn says to Anakin, your focus determines your reality. That's not true. Theology, in science we say that the universe is theory independent. It doesn't matter what our theories about the universe are. The universe is what it is. Theology is exactly the same way. We can debate dispensationalism versus covenant theology, Calvinism versus Arminianism, all these different theological ideas. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter. God is who he is. He does what he does. We can try and explain it, but we don't make it what it is. If God said it, it really matters very little whether we believe it or not. So, again, this is somehow or other, these things happen because of me? No, I don't think so. Then this last one I pulled out, I thought this was, I actually encountered this just this last week. A quote from an article from a major evangelical organization that you would all recognize if I told you. It was from an article talking about all these different non-Christian religious writings, the Quran, the Book of Mormon, all these different religious books, and why they weren't trustworthy. Because they're not part of the Bible. Okay, well, how do you know the Bible is trustworthy? Because it's the Word of God. Well, how do you know it's the Word of God? Because it said so. Well, the Book of Mormon claims to be the Word of God. The Quran claims to be the Word of God, and they both claim to be superior to the Bible, in point of fact. So as if pressed for an explanation, this is what this article said. If God had tried to prove that he existed or that his word was flawless, then any evidence or proof would be greater than God and his word. But God knows that nothing is greater than his word, and therefore he doesn't stoop to our carnal desires for such proof. Carnal desires for proof. When John the Baptist was in prison and wrestling with his faith, he had some of his disciples send word to his cousin, Jesus, that guy. So are you really the Messiah, or are we waiting on somebody else? And what did Jesus say? I'm not going to satisfy your carnal desires for proof. He said, go back and tell cuz what you've been seeing. This is the fulfillment of the prophecies about the Messiah. That's my calling card. That's my bona fides. That's the reason Jesus did miracles. That was his bona fides as Messiah. He was checking the boxes that were placed there by Daniel and Isaiah and Ezekiel. This is who I am. And this is how you know that I am, who I say I am. The problem here, the misunderstanding here in the next slide is confusing two things. We are getting into something besides me blabbering soon. Faith versus fideism. Fideism, I know I'm throwing big words and boring you guys to death. Fideism is this notion that faith does not rely on a reason, that religious truth must be accepted blindly. It's just a conscious effort. Just suck it up and believe. What's the matter with you? Buck up, Buttercup. This is not what the Bible teaches. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to go to the book of Hebrews. So to talk about this notion of faith and what faith is and we've already talked about what it's not and how it works. So the book of Hebrews was written in the latter half of the first century by an unknown second-generation believer. It was not written by an apostle. That makes it in a peer of one among the New Testament books. Hebrews 2:3 said, "How shall we escape if we ignore such a great salvation? This salvation that was first announced by the Lord was confirmed to us, including himself, by those who heard him." So the author's saying, I'm not one of the apostles. I'm someone who heard the gospel from one of the apostles. So it wasn't Paul. It was someone else. The top contenders are Luke. Many people think that if nothing else, Luke may have translated it into its current form. Clement of Rome. Clement was a co-worker with Paul. He was mentioned in Philippians 4. Catholicism venerates him as the first pope of Rome. He was Peter's successor to lead the early church in Rome. And all of Christendom agrees that he was the very first apostolic church father. Apollos. You remember Apollos? He was this dude from Alexandria, Egypt, an Egyptian Jew, who he and his followers were going around preaching the gospel of John the Baptist after Jesus had risen. And Paul encounters him, and he's like, you guys haven't exactly heard the end of the story yet, have you? And so Paul completes his training. You can keep count of all the Star Wars quotes today. And Apollos becomes a powerful co-worker with Paul. Barnabas, my favorite possible author for the book of Hebrews. Barnabas was the cousin of John Mark, the author of the book of Mark, the disciple of Peter. It was Mark's mother, Mary, who was Barnabas' aunt, who was the owner of the upper room where the disciples received the Holy Spirit, where they were hanging out when Peter was miraculously busted out of jail in Acts. And Barnabas was the guy that pulled Paul aside, took him under his wing when he was all freshly converted and hot to trot and blabbering off and getting himself in nothing but trouble. Barnabas pulls him aside and says, you need to cool your jets, bro. Let's figure this out for a while. And so Barnabas was the mentor of Paul. We don't often think about the fact that Paul had a mentor. And it was this dude Barnabas, whose name was actually Joseph. Barnabas was a nickname that meant son of encouragement. And there are other people, other contenders. It was written mostly to Jewish people who had joined the Way. That was the original name for this thing that we call Christianity today. People that had believed that Jesus was their long-awaited Messiah and were also suffering persecution. You see that throughout the book of Hebrews. And it contains extensive commentary on the Old Testament and how it relates to New Testament faith. If you want to understand something from the Old Testament and how it relates to the New Testament faith, spend time studying the book of Hebrews. And so he starts out, the first 10 chapters are this extended argument about who Jesus is, what he did, how he was superior to Moses, how he's superior to the angels. In chapter 4, there's this fascinating little bit about how God resting on the seventh day after creation, he's continued that till now. And really the point of that is that shows us preview of things to come, because heaven is an eternal Sabbath rest. In verse 5, he establishes that Jesus is our new high priest. He makes this amazing proclamation in chapter 4, verse 15, that we don't have a high priest that's unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who's been tempted in every way just as we are, but was without sin. Therefore, we can boldly approach the throne of grace and ask for help in our time of need. You have this wonderful picture of the crown prince bursting into the throne room as the king is embroiled in matters of state. And without batting an eye, the king clears the room. My son needs me. We'll take care of this later. That's the God we serve because of Jesus. Continuing on, chapter 7, the writer compares him to this mysterious person from the Old Testament called Melchizedek, about whom we know nearly nothing. We learn more about him from Hebrews than we do from the Old Testament. And then in chapter 8, he says, Jesus is not only our new high priest, he's the high priest of this new covenant that God is organizing, replacing the old covenant. And as a result of that, our worship is different. And in chapter 10, he talks about how in the old covenant, we had sacrifices done daily for sin. But the reality is the blood of bulls and goats can never erase sin. But Christ died, the new high priest of the new covenant died once for all. One time, covered all sin. And then he did something the high priest never did. He sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. When Jesus was hanging from the cross and he said, "It is finished," that's what he was talking about. The work of redemption was done. And then after all this, we get to chapter 11. Now you know about Jesus. Let me tell you what it means to trust Jesus. So chapter 11 is what we call this Hall of Fame of faith. Thursday night was the Hall of Fame game in the NFL when the Cowboys routed the Birds from Arizona. Maybe not routed, but it's filled with interesting and shady characters. Great insights into the nature of faith. Not all the stories had a happy ending. That's what we talked about 18 months ago. And as with everything, must be taken in proper context. So Hebrews 11:1 starts out. Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance of what we do not see. The old King James says faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. These two words here, substance and evidence, are absolutely critical to understand. Substance. Solid. A foundation. Substantial. Something to be built upon. Real versus imagined. This does not belong in Aunt Fanny's closet. This belongs in the living room. In the front yard. This is something real, something tangible. More importantly, it's not just a substance, it's evidence. It's proof that shows other things to be true. The sort of proof that you would bring into court to show that you really didn't do this, or this guy really did do that. This is not exactly blind. And God is certainly not refusing to offer us proof. God's offering us substantial evidence. And he proceeds to tell us this by giving us some stories to ponder. He starts out with Abel, offered a better sacrifice than Cain. And Cain was given an opportunity to save it. Remember? God told Cain, "Hey, chill for a second. I know you're mad, but in your anger, don't blow it." And what did Cain do? He walked away. Abel offered a better sacrifice. We have no idea what that was, why it was. How did he know how to do that? That's an interesting question. But at the same time, we know that God was still walking and talking with men at that point, because it says God came to Cain and said, just like he had came with Adam and Eve. Enoch, again, a shadowy figure from the Old Testament we don't know much of, direct ancestor of Noah. It says Enoch pleased God. How cool would that be? Many of us are struggling to please our friends and our families and our parents. Enoch pleased God. Noah warned of things not seen, it says. Faith is the evidence of things not seen. Noah was warned of this impending judgment, this impending doom that was unprecedented in the history of the world. And he proclaimed this. He trusted God. He saved his family. He saved a sampling of the animals of this world because he trusted God for this thing not seen. Abraham moved to a strange land, trusted God to provide him offspring, was willing to sacrifice said offspring, and was far from perfect. You know, Abraham is someone we have to be careful with because a lot of people, particularly the blind faith crowd, would have you believe that Abraham was just wandering about doing his thing, and all of a sudden God appeared out of nowhere. Says, I want you to pack up and move, and I'll tell you when you get there. Okay. Moses was just tooling around in the desert, taking care of his sheep, and this bush caught fire. And he's like, ooh, let me go see what that is. Oh, this is God. Okay, hi, God. How's it going? No. Moses had been under the tutelage of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian, who was a servant of the one true God. And he knew who God was. So when the bush was on fire, Moses knew exactly who that was. So when God said, kick your shoes off, this is holy ground, he's like, oh crap, I'm looking at God. Abraham had walked with God his whole life. And so this God that he had known, this man of whom it was said Abram was a friend of God, when God said, pack up and move, and I'll tell you when you get there, he's like, okay, let's do this. He was far from perfect. Yeah, she really is my sister. Well, yeah, she really was your half-sister. You just failed to mention she's also your wife. Twice. Just to firmly establish his place in the Knucklehead Hall of Fame. But it also says in the book of Hebrews that while he was on the mountaintop that would eventually become Temple Mount, that he believed God would have raised Isaac from the dead had he been allowed to proceed. And instead, we have the tremendous picturing of what was proclaimed as Jehovah Jireh. God saw and provided. He saw that Abram was willing to do this, and he provided a way for him to not have to. He provided a ram, and there we went. Another story, absolutely from the Knucklehead Hall of Fame, Rahab. People have tried to redeem this gal multiple times. She was running a brothel. Let's just get that out of the way. And here she is in Hebrews chapter 11, alongside Abraham and Noah and all these other people. How does this work? She believed in God. She wasn't morally upstanding. But what had happened is she said, gosh, there's this God that you guys serve that parted the Red Sea, that routed the Egyptians, and now you're coming to us. I know whose side I want to be on. Well, when did all this happen? How long had the Israelites been wandering in the desert by the time they got to Jericho? 80 years. Remember? 2 generations. 1 generation to get there, then the 12 spies, Caleb and Joshua, we can take it. No, we can't. Another generation. 2 generations had wandered in the desert. Rahab had heard these stories from her grandparents and her parents, and she believed. Now notice, proof does not equal faith. The Israelites had more proof than she did. They had walked with God for all this time. They had seen it up close. They had seen manna. They had seen quail. They had the fire tornado by night. They had the pillar of clouds by night. And every time something happened, they're like, oh my goodness, what's going to happen? The armies of Israel are marching on Jericho, and Rahab's like, I want to be on that side because I see where this ends. People refuse to accept proof every day. They refuse to accept my proof. They show up, they're smoking like a chimney, drinking like a fish. You got to mend your ways or you're going to die. Whatever. Every day. What about your stories? May gave us this tremendous testimony about the legacy her father left. I didn't tell her that beforehand, by the way. For me, I could tell multiple stories. January 3rd, 2011, about noon, I can take you to the place I was sitting. I got the horrific phone call that my mom had been killed in a car wreck. Made arrangements from the school to be gone. Within 36 hours, we were pulled into my hometown in Oklahoma. Spent the next week getting mom buried, getting my beginnings of getting my dad set up. And then I went back to med school. And for the next 5 months, my wife and kids were in Oklahoma getting my dad squared away. That was gut-wrenching. That was hard. And yet, God was proved faithful. You know, I had Christian classmates in med school that rallied around me. People in my hometown rallied around my family, and God showed up. So now my family is 1,700 miles away. We're having car trouble. Things are looking grim. We've done this before. And guess what happened before? God showed up. I have no idea how this is going to play out, but God will show up. Henry Blackaby, in his Experiencing God study, talks about this notion of spiritual markers. When the Israelites crossed the Jordan River, when God caused the waters to be piled up in a heap, he commanded one person from each tribe to pick up a rock and carry it over and make a pile of stones. Why? So that in successive generations, they would walk by this pile of rocks, and the kid would go, "Dad, what's that pile of rocks for?" This is to remind us that God caused the Jordan River to be piled up in a heap so the armies of Israel could cross on dry land and take Jericho. Throughout the Old Testament, you see these stories, and they end with the assembling of a monument, the naming of a city, the naming of a place, the naming of a well, a tree. Blackaby encourages us to do that in our lives. Something happens, do something to make it memorable, so that when you look back, you remember. What did the prophets do in the Old Testament? They didn't just say, "Buck up and believe." Come on, suck it up. No, they offered proof of God's faithfulness. And they always went back to the same few things, right? Remember the Red Sea. Remember the plagues. Remember the Jordan River. And they would talk about other things too, but in the Jewish psyche, those are the bedrock proofs of God's superiority. The plagues of Egypt, each one hammering at a specific member of the Egyptian pantheon. This is ritual spiritual combat on a cosmic scale. And God routed the Egyptian gods, who are no gods. But to the Egyptians, their entire belief system was laid waste. And to the Israelites, they were like, "Oh, I guess he really is a real God." People still refuse to accept proof. So what are the results of this faith that he's talking about? Number one, pleasing God. It said Enoch pleased God. And then it turns right around and says, without faith, it's impossible to please God. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. Not working harder. It doesn't say if you work hard enough, you'll eventually might please God. It doesn't say if you do enough things for God, eventually you might please God. Chapter 10, remember? Offering more and more and more and more and more sacrifice doesn't eventually erase the sin. That was just a placeholder until Jesus came in and took care of it. That was to drive home the fact that no amount of work on our part can ever take away sin. Only Christ and his sacrifice can do that. There is nothing we can do to please God and earn his favor. Paul dials it down even tighter in Romans 14, where he's talking about, do or don't do and all this, should you eat this or not eat that or all these different things. And he says everything that does not come from faith is sin. Without faith, it's impossible to please God, but without faith, it's impossible to do anything that's not sin. Cogitate on that for a moment. You're sitting here working hard, trying to do all these things to please God. You're doing less than spinning your wheels. You're digging a hole. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. that which is not of faith is sin. The next thing, the results of this faith is patience with God. In verse 13, all these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. They admitted they were aliens and strangers on earth. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly country. They didn't receive what was promised. They hoped for and received something better. Rather than settling for the best that this life can offer, they tabled that desire for the best that eternity can offer. How many times have we asked God for something, pleaded with God for something, didn't get it, and threw a royal temper tantrum, only to later realize that God had something better in mind for us? On January 26, 2013, I boarded a plane from Missoula, Montana to Philadelphia. My itinerary was to go from Missoula to Denver, Denver to D.C., and D.C. to Philly because, I was a poor medical student and that was the cheapest way to get there. I was going there to take this big test, one of the last test that I had to take as a med student to be eligible to graduate. 95% of the people who take this test pass it on the first attempt. I had gotten course honors and everything that mattered for this test. So I'm ready. I get to Denver, and I got a text from Orbitz. No, this is not a plug. Saying, D.C. is snowed in. Your flight from D.C. to Philadelphia is canceled. I literally had to drop to my knees to keep from passing out. I got on the phone. I said, well, can I just rent a car? They said, no, there's 3 feet of snow on the ground in D.C. You know how those knuckleheads are. They get 2 inches of snow and they're done. They had 3 feet of snow. That's why they live there and not here. I mean, here, 3 feet of snow, who cares? So, long story short, they ended up rerouting me to LaGuardia, and I drove from New York to Philadelphia. Got to experience the New Jersey Turnpike overnight. And I arrived in my hotel room, got 2 hours of sleep, went to take this test. Several weeks later, got word that I'd failed. Called the school, holy smokes, what do I do now? Well, we think this is just because, how everything worked out. Just go take it again, it should be fine. Took it a second time. I failed. Now people are beginning to wonder. So, at this point, we had already moved to Michigan. And so I spent some time with some folks up in East Lansing to further prep for this test. They said, you're fine, no big deal. You have the skills you need to pass this test. Go do it. Took it a third time. We had taken a little time off. We're in Oklahoma remodeling my folks' house so my dad had since died as well. And we were remodeling the house to get it sold. Found out I failed it a third time. 95% of people pass it on the first time. So now my school is really concerned. They're like, okay, we're bringing you back to Yakima. So I had to go back to Yakima to be tutored there. You're fine, you're great. We don't see any problem here. Go pass the dang test and be done with it. I showed up for a fourth time. At this point, my family is like, we believe God has called you here, but if you can't pass this stupid test, you can't be a doctor. So if you fail at this time, we're just going to take that as God is saying, maybe not. And, we had the family meeting, and we all agreed. Took it a fourth time. We were in Kalamazoo at the Kalamazoo Valley Museum. I got the email on my iPod, went into another place, read it, failed it a fourth time. Later that day, my son, in complete innocence, uttered the most heart-wrenching words I've ever heard. I'm sorry, Dad, you don't get to be a doctor. That was a Friday. Spent the entire weekend on my knees crying out to God. If you don't want me to be a doctor, then show me what you want me to do. You've brought me to this point. Every arrow in my life points to this moment. If this is not what you want, show me where I misunderstand. Confirm to me this is what you want, that you want me to be a doctor. I got a call from my school on Monday morning, expecting to hear, sorry, this is it. See you later. Have a nice life. And instead, the guy that was in charge of me said, I got one more idea. And so he sent me to Long Island to work with someone who's a specialist in this test. Was also working with a local doctor here who, among other things, helped me to see that I probably have some ADHD, which is why I like to chase squirrels and shiny objects. And long story short, on the 5th attempt, I passed the test. We were in Maryland at the time helping some friends remodel their house. And I saw the email, and I said, I can't deal with this. I'm not even going to open it. And about an hour later, I got a text from the registrar at my school that just said one word, congratulations. And I about beat my son's chest in my excitement. Now, God could have just said, you can pass this on the first or the second attempt, and that's fine. And I would have been okay with that. But here's what happened over the course of those 18 months. God had me in the smelter. He had me in the forge. He was beating on me. And I'm sitting here going, is this what you want me to do? Are you sure this is what you want me to do? If this is what you want me to do, then why this? And by the time I passed that test, and I can tell you to this day, I have zero doubt whatsoever that this is exactly what God wants me to do. And this is exactly the time in my life in which God wants me to do it. And if I hadn't wandered in the desert for 18 months, I wouldn't be able to say that. I had my thing that I wanted and hoped for, and instead I got something better. And my family didn't vote me off the island. There was discussion. Finally, results of faith. It's not working. There it is. Pride from God. Pride from God. Hebrews 11:13, talking about these people who were still living by faith when they died. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly country. Therefore, as a result of their faith, God was not ashamed to be called their God. Think about that for a moment. It's one thing to say Enoch pleased God. This is taking things to a whole different level. It's just God standing before the cosmos saying, that's my boy. Sticking his chest out. A little bit of swagger. Just like when in Job, when Satan comes parading before God stirring up trouble, and God's like, see my boy Job? Satan's like, let me mess with him. He's like, take your best shot, Slick. Job wasn't happy about it, but at the end, God was proved right. Or Daniel, when he's in the lion's den, and King Darius, this pagan king, comes to the lion's den the next morning and gives Daniel one of the coolest names in the Bible. Daniel, servant of the living God, whom you serve continual. Amen. You think God has a problem saying Daniel is his boy? This pagan king recognized who Daniel was. That's what's at stake here. This is, do you want to sit here and work hard and hope at the end of the day that maybe God thinks some of this is acceptable? Or do you want God to swagger around heaven going, Chris is my boy? Look at that. Even Saturday Night Weaver is my boy. Watch him cut her up. So how does this faith business work? We've talked about what it is. We've talked about what it's not. But how does it work? And how do we get it? We haven't talked about that yet. It's a cool thing. But how does it work? Well, the writer of Hebrews, as if anticipating our question, continues in chapter 12. Therefore, my grandfather, the pastor, used to always say, when you see the word therefore, you got to look at what it's there for. He's pointing back to chapter 11. Since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders us and the sin that so easily entangles and run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Since we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, all these people that went before us are there cheering us on. We're looking back at Abel and Enoch and Noah and Abraham and Rahab. And, blithely mentioned quickly are these other guys, Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David. David just gets a mentioning. Samuel and the prophets. So there's more people that are just mentioned than people are discussed. And then there's all the people at the end of the chapter who trusted God, and it didn't turn out so well. I know you can take this all away, but even if you don't, my hope is you alone. We look back on them. That is the source of our faith. Who's that for you? We know who it is for May. She looks back on her dad and the example in her life. Who do you provide that for? Because I guarantee you, every person in this church has somebody that's looking at them. This isn't a guilt trip. This is just reality. We look at Fred. We look at Don Coward. We look at Jim and Mary. Those are our cloud of witnesses, these people that have served God forever. But guess what? There's people that look to Eric Clark. I know you're shocked. There's people that look to Chris. There's people that look to John. There's people that look to each person in this room. And we look to people in this congregation. See, the reality is what Hebrews 12, 1 and 2 tells us is the reason that we can trust God is because of their example. They've gone out and done it. We don't believe these things blindly. We believe because God has shown himself to be trustworthy. Well, let me dial this down how this works. I mentioned that Thursday was the Hall of Fame game. Well, imagine, for example, there was a high school football national championship. We'll really stretch and imagine that a team from Jackson was going to go. So there's one and only one place you could hold this, right? At Hall of Fame Stadium in Canton, right? So they show up, and they've got a whole week to practice. At the end of each practice day, the coach takes them into the hall. And they see Don Shula. They see Don Meredith. They see Joe Namath promising to win the Super Bowl and making good on that promise. They see the catch, the immaculate reception. They see Roger Staubach heaving the first Hail Mary. They see Bart Starr diving over the line in the Ice Bowl. They see Emmitt Smith dragging the Cowboys to a Super Bowl with a separated shoulder. And by the end of the week, these guys are ready to play football. But then on game day, they're sitting there, and this curtain opens. And behind the curtain is Roger and Terry Bradshaw and Emmitt Smith and all these heroes they've been hearing about all week long. Would these guys win this game? That's what this is. That's what God has done for us. That's the bona fides that God offers for us to have this faith. This is the basis for our faith. It's not blind. It's not without proof. It's not in spite of evidence to the contrary. It's a faith that's based on proof. It's based on evidence. It's based on history. Faith is reasonable. So what does this mean for us? Why do we do what we do? Do we do what we do because it's what we've always done? Because it's comfortable and we like it that way? Because it's what other churches are doing? Is that the reason we're using the orange curriculum? Because it's the cool thing to do now? Or is it because Are we doing what we do because God has proven himself trustworthy? See, we trust God because of what he has done in our lives and in the lives of those around us. Hebrews 10, 23 through 25 says that's the reason we meet together, is to encourage each other. So that I can look at Fred's life, and John can look at my life, and people can look at Jim and Mary's life. And we can say, this is what God is doing in their life, so I know he can do something in my life. What about you individually? Faith is reasonable. Faith makes sense. We're trusting a God who's proven himself to be faithful. We don't need to trust blindly. More importantly, you can't please God by working harder and doing more. Now, this doesn't suggest that we sit on our hands, but it's an issue of motivation. Why are we doing what we're doing? Without faith, it's impossible to please God. That which is not of faith is sin. Who's your cloud of witnesses? And I want everybody to go home today and think, who are the people that speak into my life? And think about doing something to say, I am glad to have you in my life. Maybe it's not someone that's living. Maybe it's someone that's dead. Maybe it is someone that's still living. And then think about, in whose cloud of witnesses are you? Because I guarantee everyone in this room is part of somebody's cloud of witnesses. This is the basis of our faith.